So here's a question. How many times can you be gaslighted before you push back? How many times can you be baited, doubted, lied to, betrayed? How many times can these things happen to you without you ever reacting? One of the challenges about the stuff I talk about to help you navigate these relationships, stuff like radical acceptance and realistic expectations and don't be surprised when they act badly, is that there is almost an implicit assumption that having all of these tools, that you will learn to never take the bait, to never react, to not have emotion. That assumption that you really get, that of course the narcissistic person in my life is going to lie and be manipulative and not listen and behave in an entitled way, so that I'm not surprised, or they're going to bait me and I don't need to take the bait. All that sounds great on paper, right? But it is almost impossible in practice. We are human beings. Gloriously imperfect human beings. We are not narcissism processing robots. Most people go into human interactions needing and wanting connection, safety, empathy, attunement. So our narcissistic relationships definitely throw us off a bit. And then over time, even once you get it and you see it and you integrate all of this education about narcissism, no matter how good you get at it, all of us will still get thrown off. As we should, because none of this is healthy. So, here's an example. I was thinking about a couple I know well. Husband's narcissistic, classical, vulnerable narcissist. The wife is healthy, empathic, stable. She's sweet. She was always very resistant to this idea of seeing him as narcissistic, but it was so clear that he was. She had a narcissistic parent. She knew sort of what this would mean. And so she kept interacting with her husband as though he had a healthy personality. And that was a mess pretty much almost every day. Having to accept he was narcissistic was hard for her because it meant that she also had to then accept that he wouldn't change, and she was not ready to let that sink in, and she didn't want the marriage to end. So they go into couples therapy. And 90% of the time in life and in their couples therapy, really this woman keeps it completely together, which is quite amazing. But from time to time, his behavior would get to her. He would often lie about what he was doing, or gaslighted her regularly, or chronically painted himself as a victim. She is the primary breadwinner. And he would moan and groan about how he has to work so hard. And he viewed himself as relatively faultless, while he would often paint this picture of her as being crazy and unstable. Knowing both of these people, it was a completely untrue characterization of her. She really is a very stable, actually very stoic person, given all that she's been through between the parent and the partner. But like most narcissistic folks, he's smart. He's articulate. He's very witty. And even though his jokes always have sort of like a bitter, sharp edge to them, he tells them and he sells them well. He's good timing. You really need to understand narcissism to pick up that the bitter edge in his jokes actually reflect a rather aggrieved, angry, bitter person. But most people just saw it as his wicked sense of humor. She was often the butt of his jokes in public. And he would always take these jokes to the very edge and then spin back at the last minute. And if she showed any discomfort at this basically public humiliation, she was gaslighted and would be told that she couldn't take a joke, or come on, relax, sit down. Anyhow, her capacity to endure his behavior, really, it was world class, like elite fighting forces level stuff. She was willing to learn about narcissism and read the books, hard as it was, and do the workarounds. She had to learn them anyhow to manage her parents. So she did just about everything herself in the house, from the household to doing her career, to coordinating their social lives, to raising their children, while he did his job, which was not as demanding as hers, and complain and bang about the house and complain when things were not exactly the way he wanted, but he wouldn't do them himself. He was sort of a chronic malcontent about everything, and She was actually a pretty temperamentally cheerful person. She loved other people. She loved being socially, and he generally did not. And so she would often find herself cut off from other social supports. But she was able to endure, and she'd put her head down, and she'd get it all done, and she learned to never ask for anything, and to keep all the stress away from him, and to never bother him with stuff like broken dishwashers or stuff like that, although her job was far more time consuming. But every so often, his lying, his gaslighting, his digs, his tantrums, when he would be asked to change a schedule because of their kids, it would get to her. And every so often, very rarely, but every so often, she'd react. Nothing dramatic, but her face would generate surprise like that, right? Her volume would increase a little. She would voice her protest. She told me that when she has done that, he would talk to her and treat her like she was a crazy person, tell her, you need to calm down, and that you get really worked up. And that on the rare occasion that this would happen on her face in couples therapy, the same thing would happen. She would be called out by the therapist for getting emotional or dysregulated. But keep in mind that 90% of the time she was keeping it together despite the husband's chronic emotional abuse. And that right there captures a key imbalance that we see in these relationships. The enablers, the people around you, may not be willing to call the other person's behavior out as toxic and problematic and manipulative or related to narcissism. Maybe they would call them difficult or quirky, or that is just how they are. But they will expect the other partner, the other people in that relationship, to keep it perfectly together, well-regulated, despite the constant mistreatment. But the first time you have a real reaction, you're the one who's being dysregulated. Now, obviously, this is the ultimate gaslight in these relationships, but it puts people in a position where dissociation and numbness become a new normal, and it starts to bleed into other relationships and parts of your life. To be completely non-reactive to a narcissistic person for a long time doesn't mean that you're well-regulated. It means that you might be downright dissociated or that you've had to turn most of you off. Because it's normal to respond when someone is manipulating you and lying to you and betraying you and gaslighting you and baiting and betraying and poking at you 100 times a day. That's normal. What's normal is what this woman was doing, is being able to keep it together 90% of the time with a smile on her face. But the one time she's affected and lets it show, then she's called the unhinged one. It's often these adjustments that we learn to make within ourselves to make these relationships sustain and keep going. Those adjustments we make are what do the harm to us. And while they are often necessary workarounds to avoid more rage, to protect kids or other people, or just to keep life going, to really keep it up, you do have to almost really disconnect from yourself and learn to stop reacting to just about anything. Because your reactions do get judged. And keep in mind too, that what may seem on a given day like a small dig to the people who are witnessing what's going on between you and this other person, they don't understand that this represents a culmination of days, weeks, months, and years of digs. And so when you do react in a way that may seem disproportionate to the thing that was said to you, I mean, people don't like watching conflict, then you're the problem. You're the dysregulated one. They don't see everything that led up to that point. And the conversation becomes, well, maybe both of you need to work on regulating, and both of you need to work on how you show up. Some of you still watching may wonder, why didn't that lady just leave her marriage, especially since she was the primary breadwinner? And many of you already know that we never ask a survivor why they stay or don't go. Many of you already know that the answer lies in not wanting to roll the dice in family court. The husband was well aware of his leverage in family court, and he would fight for 50% just to stick it to her, even though he didn't have the patience to manage the children. And that was a bet that she was not ready to take. Because people can't see the rest of the iceberg, the behavioral iceberg that's under the water, they may look sideways at your reaction when you have a strong, not even loud, but kind of strong reaction to something that seems small to them. And you might even have someone like a couples therapist tell you that you're dysregulated or reacting too strongly, or friends or family tell you that you're hot-headed. But they aren't seeing the day-to-day. And all of this makes you feel like you're going crazy. And it may set you up to say, okay, I'm just going to learn to not react to anything. But then you slowly numb to everything. And that hurts you, and it hurts your kids and other people who know you and work with you and care about you, because you literally have to turn yourself off. However, yeah, when you get numb enough, you don't react, but you also don't live. People don't like feeling hopeless. And I think that is why narcissistic people get away with so much. The idea that someone's personality and behavior are not really going to change is a very uncomfortable one for us to get our heads around. And remember, the narcissistic person doesn't think they need to change. They think that their problematic behavior is someone else's fault. But when people see the bad behavior, they want to think that something can be done. And when it doesn't change over time, it's actually easier to blame the other person in the relationship and not hold the narcissistic person accountable. And frankly, that's unacceptable. But if the only choice becomes numbness versus having a reaction 1 out of every 10 times, it's a tough choice, because ultimately that numbness can really pull us out of our lives in so many ways. Thanks again.